This is Impact with Don Wenner.
Hey everyone, Don Wenner here, founder and CEO of DLP Capital, and host of the Impact Podcast. Today we have Claudia Sahm on the show. She is the founder of Stay at Home Macro Consulting, SAHM. She is a regular opinion writer on Bloomberg and the New York Times. She has policy and research expertise on consumer spending, fiscal stimulus, and on the financial well-being of households. The key takeaways of this episode are, number one, why small businesses are having a hard time getting employees to return post-COVID. Number two, productivity. Productivity staying at home versus productivity in the office, in the workplace. And three, the fact that small businesses are who create jobs. Let's go ahead and dive into my conversation with Claudia Sahm. Hey, Claudia, thank you so much for joining here on Impact. I'm excited to have you on the show today.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here.
Well, excellent. Well, I'd love to go ahead and let you tell your story a little bit to listeners. Tell us a little about yourself and your area of focus here today.
Right. So I am currently a senior fellow at the Jane Family Institute. And the start of my career, especially thinking about economic policy, was at the Federal Reserve. So I joined as a staff economist in the summer of 2007, focused on consumer spending and forecasting. And my first year was an absolute birth by fire. But I learned a lot about the macroeconomy, a lot about monetary policy, and maybe surprisingly, I did a lot of work on fiscal policy, like how it was helping or not helping families, consumers during the financial crisis and the long recovery after that. I spent a year at the White House working in the Council of Economic Advisors towards the end of the Obama administration. I've had a little bit of time in think tank in DC, advised a lot of members of Congress in the last year about COVID. I've been busy. I am very dedicated to good economic policy, like stuff that actually works and gets to the people as intended. And I think, we're going to talk about small businesses today. And in addition to being an area where I feel like I have some things to say today about, what's happening in the economy and what we can all be doing to get us to a better place. I grew up on a 4-generation family farm in Indiana. And for those of you in that area, I mean, that's being a small business and an entrepreneur. And so I think this is part of where me being practical and like it's got to actually work in the end comes from. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today.
Well, awesome. So as you said, one of the big kind of overarching topics we want to get into is small businesses. And this my focus here is making an impact on the jobs crisis. And I believe, small businesses are just an incredible piece to that puzzle. And I'll just start off with kind of a broad question then, how do you go about gauging, the effect and the importance of small businesses on our overall economy here in the U.S.?
Right. Well, we know from decades and decades of experience that small businesses are essential to the U.S. economy. Right. And you can see it in a lot of different ways, but one that's pretty clear in terms of macroeconomic indicators is just how many jobs do small businesses generate? And it's a lot of jobs, right? So we know this has been an important employer. We also know small businesses are really the foundation of a lot of communities, right? So it goes way beyond giving people paychecks. It's also kind of that fabric of, American life, right? So not to wax too poetic, but I mean, these are roles that small business play. And we also know over several decades, particularly in some sectors like retail, there's been a lot of pressure on small businesses to compete and stay open, keep paying their workers good wages, right? So there have been these longstanding issues, and that's just a few of them, but there's been longstanding issues that small businesses face challenges. They also have some unique opportunities, and it makes a lot of sense why we economists and policymakers spend time thinking about small businesses. And there is no one size fits all approach because there are millions and millions of business owners. They're in all kinds of different industries. And we've seen in this last year, COVID didn't hit everybody in the same way. And so again, you can't have a one size fits all approach to the issues small business owners are facing.
Well said. So that's a perfect lead in. The COVID's created a number of unique challenges. And you said not every area, not every business, and every industry has been affected the same. But when it comes to small businesses, what we see and find, and we work with a lot of small businesses that we're helping scale their organization. I just wrote a book called Building an Elite Organization, and it's about helping small businesses scale. And all these, no matter what industry I talk to, if they're in growth mode, they are having tremendous pressure and challenges in finding good people and getting them to go back to work. Yet we see all these stats of heavy unemployment and missing targets of people getting back into the workforce. But you talk to small business owners and they need people and can't fill their jobs fast enough. So what's the mismatch here? Why are companies struggling to get people to want to work, to come back to work? What are you seeing in this unique environment right now?
Right. And I'll say first, it's amazing that this is the conversation we're having right now. Where are the workers when you need them? Right? Because this time last year, the economy was in free fall, right? People couldn't pay their workers, right? So within a year, and I mean, this is a much better world to be living in right now. It's a problem if you can't hire the workers you need back, but this is a much better problem than having to lay people off. But well said. It's still a problem, right? And so I think this is one where there's a lot of questions about this, right? So one of the things that is so unusual about this recovery, also is about the recession, is we have had millions and millions of people drop out of the labor force. They're not even looking for work. This is not normal, right? And there's a lot of reasons this could be. People could have been afraid of getting sick and dying of COVID, so they didn't want to work. They may have more family responsibilities because schools are closed. There's just a lot of things. So much of the world got turned upside down last year. And so it's maybe not surprising after the fact that people walked away from the labor market. And yet it is surprising if we'd been thinking about, hey, what's going to happen in the next recession? So we still have millions of unemployed workers, and they're looking for work. So, right, figuring out why is it they're not working? Is it because the jobless benefits they're getting are generous enough that they're not ready to take the jobs that are being offered to them? Is it something about transportation issues? I mean, a lot of workers who've been working in downtown cities like in Washington, D.C., the jobs aren't there right now. Government workers are all sitting at home, like I am in Arlington, Virginia, right? So getting to work isn't easy if your work changes sometimes. So there are these unemployed workers, and presumably those are the ones that'll be, quote unquote, the easiest to get back. I am skeptical that ending some of the jobless benefits early, that's going to bring some people back because you got to be able to pay the bills.
Right.
But that's not going to bring back the people who've dropped out of the labor force. And it's not entirely clear what will. I mean, I personally think people are going to want to go back as much as they can to the life they had before COVID. But there are people that say, well, maybe they're just rethinking their career path. Maybe they want to spend more time with their kids. Their kids must be better behaved than mine. So there's a lot of question marks, and that makes it complicated to think through what can employers do. Now, I think, well, first of all, the federal government can't wave the magic wand and get us back to February of 2020 or something better, right? They're pursuing policies. I think, there have been ways to support small businesses up to this point. There are things they can do going forward. And there are definitely things state and local governments can do to just make the labor market work better, address problems that we had before, like occupational licensing that was really, out of control in some areas. The other thing I think for small businesses, you hear a lot about, oh, well, just raise the wages. Now, I mean, like I said, I grew up on a family farm. There are limits to how much you can pay people and still pay yourself and, keep the business going. There are some other ways that employers, and I'm sure a lot of people are doing this already, can be creative in terms of how can I make the job more workable? And so particularly in a lot of the lower wage service sectors, the work schedules are unpredictable, right? Some people are actually on call. Like when there's more customers that pick up the phone, you got to show up. There are a lot of workers who maybe find their schedule out 2 or 3 days ahead of time. Now that can be complicated in good times, but people were making it work, right? They were figuring it out. But now when you've got kids at home, transit is not running at full capacity, like things like that can make it just impossible to go back. So that's just one example of how like there are ways that don't necessarily mean the wages going up. I mean, if you can raise wages, this is a good way right now to get workers, but there are other ways to make the job appealing and doable for the workers.
Great feedback. And you led into right, my next question. What can employers do? You know, what do you think? You know, that was a great example there, the flexible work schedule. What do you think employers who want to help people get back, want to not only help their companies but help this crisis of people unemployed? What can we do to help people be able to get back into the workplace? And how do you see the work from home environment that many companies have lived in this past year plus? How do you see that affecting the job market in the future? And you think it's something that companies should continue to do, will continue to do? How will it change the short-term and long-term landscape?
Yeah. This moment is going to require not just the creativity that I talked about before, like what is it specifically you as a small business owner could do to get workers back. It's going to require flexibility and patience. And we saw this, I mean, February of 2020 feels a lifetime away, but in the last years of the expansion, people kept coming back into work. People who had been out of work for decades, people who had been receiving disability benefits, right? Really, it was like, how are we continuing to hire and create all of these jobs month after month? And what we learned from that is a lot of people do want to work. They have limits on whether they can work or their schedules. I think people that have health condition are a good example. A lot of times, not even that they necessarily need health coverage, but they need an employer who understands, you know, some days I get sick and I can't come in.
Right.
And if you fire me, like this is extremely disruptive. So it's for employers to think about hiring, taking a chance. I mean, training is not free, right? I mean, there's cost the employer, but having an open mind and really seeing the potential in people, maybe workers that don't even see that potential in themselves, and getting them in, getting them trained, like, and finding a way to really integrate them, because we do know that if you can get a worker connected to a business and really create a work relationship, like that pays off over time. And that, I think we're in a moment where, after all that we've lived through, that this could be a time to strengthen some of those work relationships. And that's going to mean employers think hard about, well, what do we need to do to make these partnerships work? And a small business owner will have a lot better sense of their industry, their area. I mean, workers have to meet businesses where they are, but frankly, like the creativity and the flexibility has got to come from the boss, right?
Great point. So you touched on the importance of the relationship there. And, you know, we have a DLP here. We run a 430-person organization with multiple physical locations. So we are a Zoom company, have been way before COVID, and went to even more working from home as everybody else did through this COVID environment. And one of the things I always say is, individually, as long as you're a driven, motivated individual, you can be as productive or arguably more productive in a work from home environment, because you're not driving to work and driving home, and there's no water cooler talk and so forth. But I always look at it that teams are less productive when people are remote than together. And for a lot of reasons, and one of them is the depth of the relationship that gets built. So especially you think of kids coming right out of college or school, trying to move up in the career. It's hard to do that when your boss is in remote and you only know each other through Zoom. You're not building these deep relationships. So how do you see the importance of physical office settings or work settings in people being able to build these deep relationships and organizations being able to grow and employ more people versus this, what many think, so-called experts are saying, we're going to have this immense wave of people working from home because employers don't have to pay for office space anymore, and it's more productive and so forth. So how do you see that affecting, the ability to build relationships and drive the economy?
Right. I think, and again, I don't have a crystal ball. This is a very live topic. I think we're going to see a lot of hybrid. This is going to be very specific to industries. And yet, because you think about, if it's a service job, right? Like if you're doing something for someone else, you need to be face to face.
Right.
And in fact, we saw some services, particularly if you think about in healthcare, that went online,
right?
Because they had to. And it was a horrible experience, but we lived an experiment with, can we do this online? Can we be productive? I think there's a lot that we lost in the last year. One thing that we gained is a sense of resiliency, right? I was talking with my son who's been home, or he's been at home, digital, online. He's 10 years old. This was tough. He's a real social kid. This was hard. And one of his teachers said, the kids, they lost ground this year. There's no question about it. It's not the same being just from all that was happening in the world, but they said, you know what? They gained skills that many adults don't even have before COVID, is they learn to roll with the punches and adapt to a new environment. So I think we learned we can do this, right? And we can do the virtual in spaces where before we thought we couldn't. And a lot of employers we're not trying this, right? But as you said, it's not always in person, has some downsides. Always online has some downsides. So this flexibility and creativity about, okay, what's the right mix? And it's going to be messy, right? Like this, as we start to transition back to the old world, we're going to figure out it doesn't fit. And some of these things that were problems before will be so glaring because we got away from them for a year. I am so happy not to have commuted for the last year. And I don't even have a bad commute. It was a total waste of time, right? So I think, and again, this is where the federal government is not going to answer this question. State and local governments are not going to answer this question. It is the business owner who is going to have to decide, what do I want to do next? Now, if they make choices that aren't reasonable, they're going to hear about it from their workers, right? So it would behoove everyone to kind of be holding hands on this. But I personally think people crave seeing other people, even the kind of feisty coworkers. Like it's there's just something about being around people and building the trust and the relationships that are absolutely essential when it gets a little tough with the work, right? You got to have that trust to fall back on. And yet going back to the way things were in a lot of cases, frankly, just isn't possible. And it's a moment where we can do better. Right. And so it's a moment we ought to seize as the thinnest of silver linings from the past year.
Awesome. Thank you. So you've talked to that this answer is going to come from small businesses but there has been in the last year, obviously, a lot of, public policy that's affected many businesses in good ways and not so good ways, depending on the industry and so forth. So, how do you reflect back, and obviously a lot of the effects of some of these decisions aren't yet fully understood. But if you look at, say, PPP as obviously one of the biggest, public policies in history, and how do you think about the program, the positives that have come from it, the challenges? What do you think, looking back just now, months later, we should have done differently? How are you reflecting and thinking about it?
Right. I think the Payroll Protection Loan Program was a very well-intended program. Congress put real money behind it. from the very beginning, it was clear to me that it was going to have serious implementation problems. And I would imagine any small business owner that applied, even those who got the loans, know what I'm talking about,
Sure.
right? It was run through the Small Business Administration, which is a relatively small federal agency. The real work was done by the banks to get the loans out. And there was way more demand, particularly early on when the world was in free fall. Small business owners left and right needed money, especially the idea of keeping workers connected to their jobs is huge. Like there are European countries, and particularly Germany, this is their main way to fight recessions. They just start paying the paychecks. Right. And so that means when times are good, like now, you don't have to go find the workers, you just bring them back. Right. And so it's a great idea for a program, putting it on a small agency and banks to run it when there weren't enough funds. And what we saw, and this was my big concern, what was announced and sadly came to pass, was that banks found their best customers. Like you had to really hustle and pull some connections to get those early loans. That is not how government policy is supposed to work, right? Like if you're eligible for it and you can't get it, they might as well as not even have passed it, right? And so it caused a lot of confusion. And yet it did help, like to the businesses that got it, it helped. To the workers who continued to be connected to their employers, it helped because as things got better, they had jobs. And we got a lot of more small businesses to the other side of this crisis, or at least to this point, than we would have otherwise. So I don't want to say, like when it was announced, I was like, go for it. Like this in principle is such a great program. And yet the next time we do this, we should do it right. And so but this is true across a whole wide range of programs in the last year, just that were a lifeline and they largely worked, but they were all messy. And there's a moment for Congress and administration to step back and say, hey, what worked, what didn't work. Unfortunately, this is not the kind of introspective project that Washington, D.C. is known for. But we do know more the next time we have to slap this thing together in a recession. I think it was a really good policy to have. I think it was a better policy than we have had for small businesses in the past. It was more money. It was a bigger, more ambitious program. It put a lot of pressure on small business owners to figure out a complicated system that frankly was not set up to work very well at a moment where they had a million other problems they were trying to figure out. So that was the unfortunate. And I had a friend from high school who owns a car dealership out in Arizona and messaged me as like, there's all these different plans and he's like, I just am totally confused. My bank won't do it. And I was just like, just hang in there. Right. Like this, I'm sorry. Like, that's all I can say. Like, we got through it, but that was putting pressure on people that there was no reason to add to it. But that was life this last year. We all got more than we deserved.
Yeah, well said. We're in the process right now of acquiring a community bank. And so we've been, over this past year, we evaluated and talked to a lot of community banks that we're looking to buy, and hearing the stories of just how crazy and disorganized that program was pretty astounding. I mean, the banks literally didn't know what was happening, how the program works, how the forgiveness would play out. And to your point, it was great for the small community banks who were able to work around the clock and solve for it, because a lot of companies, big bank relationships, basically said, sorry, we're only serving our Fortune 500 or 5,000 clients, and we're not able to help you. So it was interesting, to say the least. But no doubt, I know many businesses that wouldn't be here today if it hadn't been for the program. And a lot of jobs even more jobs that wouldn't be here. So it's a great perspective. So I want to switch gears a little bit here to your perspective on inflation. So I think there's a lot of argument today, I'll call it, on whether we're in an inflationary environment, if this is a permanent inflation or this is a short-term blip due to coming out of COVID. So I'll just open it up from there. How do you think about inflation today? Do you feel it's here? How is it going to affect the economy and small businesses in the future?
The debate that we're having about inflation right now, many parts of it just aren't really productive, right? Like, we don't live in the 1970s. Like, it is not time to get the bell bottoms out and grow the hair long, right? Like, this is 2021 is a fundamentally different world. Now, it is similar in the sense that no one wants their paycheck eaten up by, prices rising every time you go to the grocery store, right? Like, people also really dislike having a paycheck. So there are some constants across the generations, but the factors that pushed us into an inflationary spiral when wages stagnated in the 1970s, early 1980s, those are different. Now, that's not to say that we don't have things happening that could put us in a bad place, but like, we should focus on those and really think hard about, should I be worried about this? And the most important thing that I think gets missed, and I kind of get it. Like, I would like to forget last year happened, right? Like, but we can't think about 2021 without remembering 2020. And I like to think of this not so much inflation, but reflation, right? Last year, inflation was really low, right? Prices weren't going up. And there were sectors where prices got cut. Like, it was a lot cheaper to fly home to Indiana. Like, the tickets were cheaper. I went shopping for clothes back in January, and I felt bad leaving the store. Like, this is a store I'd go to a lot. And it was like, I felt like I was robbing the store, like, because I had all these clothes and I hadn't paid much. And when I go back now, the prices are more like I saw before. So if you don't have prices catch back up some, I mean, these small business, like airlines, cannot keep going with prices that are low. The local clothing store can't keep selling their clothes. Like, they're doing it at a loss last year. So some of the prices rising, some of the inflation we see is a sign the economy is getting better. Now, we're seeing it come fast, right? Which can be kind of scary, but the government and the vaccines going after COVID, right? Like, things are moving fast in a good direction. Now, you can't have too much of a good thing. And so we've seen prices come back a lot. If the inflation slows and we kind of stay up at this healthier level of prices, fine. That's what the Fed thinks is going to happen. Now, I mean, they don't have a crystal ball either. But there's other stuff that's happened, what gets referred to as these supply chain issues, right? And things like, we can't get the semiconductors to build more cars, and there's all this demand for cars, and so those prices go up. Or there's always something going on with energy, like gas prices, pipelines go down, ransomware attacks, right? So if you have enough of these things, that all the bad stuff goes in one direction and it pushes up prices, even if usually, those things are temporary, they'll work themselves out. Like, we don't know that right now. Right now, we're getting data on prices that says they rose really fast from March to April, right? So it's what comes next that's important. And the world is so different right now that we can legitimately have a debate about risks, but we need to center that in the reality of what we have just lived through and not what they were living through in the 1970s, right? Like, we got to understand what's causing the phenomenon that we see around us, not just, oh, wow, prices are going up. It's like, well, why? Why are they doing that? So I think it's a debate we need to have. It affects people. It affects every single one of us when we go and buy stuff, right? So it's a debate we should be having, and we should be holding policymakers accountable if they're doing stuff that pushes us into the danger zone. I see prices coming up, and I'm relieved the economy is recovering. But if they keep going up at this kind of a clip, I will change my mind on that, and then it's time to, tap on the brakes and get it under control.
Awesome. So there's definitely a lot of debate about inflation, as you said, and very different than in past times, and a lot of it driven by supply chain today. I'm going to switch gears just a moment from kind of small businesses and to another area I believe you have quite a bit of expertise around, that in my eyes, there's no doubt we're seeing tremendous increase in prices and have been since well before COVID, which is housing. And so often when people think of the housing market, they generally think to, the housing market in terms of homes for sale and purchase. And, we're going through the greatest growth in home prices in any year in history in many market, largely driven by this incredible low supply and incredible low interest rates, where for many, it's still cheaper to own a home today than it was at any point in the past 10, 20 years, right? So I look at that as a little different than rent. And the cost of rent has gone up over 70% in the past decade. So in 2010, the average rent in America was a little over $700. Today, it's right around $1,200 is the average rent in America. 70% growth in rent, and that is rent certainly in the workforce housing space that we focus on, is soaring up right now at a pace we've never seen, but it's been going up consistently for a decade. And the way I always think about it is rents have gone up, 70% this past decade, while the average income for, most wage earners, the bottom 75% of wage earners, have only gone up in the single digits. So how do you think about this crisis of the affordability of housing for most of the workforce, and how that plays out with the challenge you mentioned a little bit earlier, that the solution isn't just for companies to raise wages or the government to mandate it, because that can lead to less jobs, and which I want to get into in a few minutes. But how do you think about this challenge with affordability and what's causing it, and what do we do about it?
Right. So housing affordability is a perfect example of an area we had problems before COVID, right? In the best of time, we had millions of people spending over half of their wages to keep a roof over their head.
Over a quarter of Americans today. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a problem. That's a big problem. But that was in the best of times, right? That was like 3.5% unemployment. So COVID, we had multiples of 3.5% unemployment. And we were in a pandemic where you needed to have a home, like to, be able to distance. And so it made so clear how tragic and how dysfunctional our housing system had become. And particularly if you think of, like you said, housing for workers, like people that maybe aren't going to get the big mortgage and buy the house, but need a place to live at someplace affordable. So that made it work. Now, there were very specific programs that were put in place, like eviction moratoriums, forbearance on mortgages, forbearance on student loans outside of the housing space. And I think that's great, but it wasn't forgiveness, right? That money comes due. And so that's a place where I think we need to have more of policy conversation about, well, what do we do on the other side of that? But it did keep people from getting kicked out of their homes. Now, you had to have a home or an apartment, but it did keep that in place. But now is the moment to do something to fix the problem that we came into with COVID. And there are conversations. So the infrastructure package that Congress is debating right now, in some proposals, there are hundreds of billions of dollars set aside for the construction of affordable housing. And that would, fundamentally, the reason that rental prices have gone up decade after decade, and we have a quarter of families spending half their paychecks, is we don't have physically enough housing.
Right.
So you can't just give people money to pay the rent that'll just bid up the price if there's no more places to live. You got to build. So the federal government can put money to it. They can allocate taxpayer money to do what they think is best for the communities. State and local governments can step in, and small business owners can push them to do this, to relax some of the zoning requirements and make it friendly to build and less onerous to get the building permits and the processes, and help community neighborhood groups understand that it's good to help people have a place to live, which is a tough advocacy. And I think one place where I feel, I mean, it gets political at a local level, right? Like the not in my backyard, yes, in my backyard, but there's so much that we can do in that space, and we can keep in mind, like we just need to build, right? And it can be okay in a large city to build expensive apartments because that frees up some other apartments. So you need government to go in and be affordable, but you also like just let businesses, if they can make a profit building, give them space, especially multifamily places where you can imagine, multiple people and like using the land effectively. But this is one where the federal government can put some money on the line. Money is good. Subsidizing loans is good for building, but they got to have a place to build. And the state and local governments have a lot more control of those levers, and local activism. Like I said, small businesses are key to communities, and those are places where they can help guide the community and kind of think about what would be good policy solutions that balance out the costs and the benefits of building more housing. But like that has to happen, or that crisis gets worse.
Yeah, extremely well said, and that is absolutely where it starts. And I think you said it really well there. We need to build, right? And even if the construction costs where they are today make it very hard, and it's part of the problem, it makes it very hard to build housing that is affordable without subsidies. But if there was more supply, that'll in effect lower rents or stop the rapid increase of rents and markets. And that's definitely fundamental. And it's being a developer and builder, it's certainly never been harder than it is almost everywhere in the country to build today. It's challenging. So well said. So I'm going to switch back to small businesses. Did you have anything to add there?
No, it's good.
Okay, so I'm going to switch back to kind of small businesses and jobs here, and that there's a lot of experts out there and stats out there of the effects of automation and technology and computerization, machines that are going to replace a lot of jobs. And many argue that COVID has dramatically accelerated the pace a lot of this is going to happen. One of the stats I've heard recently is 30 to 50% of jobs in America today are at jeopardy of automation in the next 10 to 15 years. Doesn't necessarily mean all of them will be automated, but if rising wages continue or start happening more, that drives more companies to choose automation, right, and replace jobs. So with the fact that we can look at so many industries where it's obvious, I think one of the easiest examples is cashiers or tellers of an industry of millions of people that is dramatically going to decline. And so as you think about the effects of automation on jobs today, how do you think about it? What do you think we're going to face, and what's the solution? How do we turn this from a major fear and disruption into an opportunity for the country today?
Right. So automation changing the workplace has been with us for generations, right? And your point about there are millions of jobs that exist right now that aren't going to be around, or there's not going to be many people working them in 10 years, right? And like I said, I grew up on a family farm. The number of farmers in the United States is far less. Like when my dad retired, there were so many more in the community I grew up in, and yet that community produced more corn, more soybeans than it produced in any of the 4 generations that had been on that farm, right? And that was, it was tough for people who loved being farmers to have to walk away from that. And in some cases, there was a lot that happened in agriculture. That's a whole other conversation. But like, we're more productive. Like, we use the land better. We have more food for less money. So, and, my brother now, he walked away from farming, and he works now selling construction equipment. He could help you with your building, so like, and he's fine, right? So like it was just a next step. It can be very disruptive for the people who are living through the automation and see their jobs go away. This was, back in the 1970s when we were building all of these, big industrial plants and people had manufacturing jobs and unions. A lot of those jobs are gone, or frankly, there's just fewer of them because a lot of their coworkers now are giant machines that do some of the work. So that was a transition. We've seen many transitions. There are benefits to automation. Technology is good. We do not want technology to stop, right? We have a lot of vaccines really quick because we had great technology in the medical space. Like let's keep that going. And yet we do have to understand that there are winners and losers from automation and from jobs disappearing, jobs changing. You don't want to fight that, right? Fighting technology is a losing battle, right? Both because, time marches on and there are real benefits. But we do need to understand that there are some people that this hurts. And we have to think about ways to bring them along. Some of these, again, are government programs, but a lot of it would be helping workers make those transitions, which is hard sometimes, whether it's retraining or helping them connect to other jobs, but absolutely making sure that our education system is set up, that we're getting people ready for those new jobs and jobs we don't even yet know, but we kind of get a sense of skills, right? Like understanding computers, having this flexibility of, I'm not going to start one career and retire in that same career. Just understand, and to have an educational system that it's not all about just pushing people to get college degrees in certain, specific area. Like we need occupational training and retrain, over time. And one of the things the Atlanta Fed after the Great Recession had helped convene a big effort on workforce development. And a lot of it was just bringing the groups together. And one of the things that was surprising to them, and I think a lot of the people in the group when they came together, is that they realized you had all these different, community colleges doing training, you had employers that were looking for workers, you had community groups that were, supposed to be helping, and they didn't talk to each other. Right? They realized the businesses who weren't talking to the community colleges. And it's like, how is this going to work? If you're all pointed at the same goal, but you would be so much more effective if you're working together. So I think that's where, when we have a big challenge, like the world of work is changing, we need a big solution, but a big effective solution means you have lots of different groups that are all rowing in the same direction. And sometimes we've done that well, and sometimes we haven't. So like that's the solution to automation, is making it work for people.
Wow. So that was phenomenal. And it led me into, I'm going to make my last question here. So, we've talked a lot about many of the different challenges, and many we didn't get to or only breached the surface on, related to, jobs in America today and the challenges small businesses, face in this environment. And this podcast called Impact is primarily, our listenership is those looking to make an impact, from small businesses looking to scale and grow in this environment, to real estate operators, developers, builders, and then wealthy, successful individuals looking to invest their capital in ways that make an impact, both their investments and their philanthropy. So knowing that that's our listenership here today, can you kind of summarize here what you would say for those listening? What would be your main message in terms of what can we do? What can these different groups do today to help fuel small businesses, to help make an impact on jobs? What would be your main takeaways to leave us with here today?
Right. So first and foremost, the solutions, like the answer to your question, is going to come from the small business owners, right? Like I can give a lot of suggestions, and we've talked about some, but it's going to be so specific to the industry, what community you're in, who your customers are, what your vision is for your business. And yet there are some broad principles, right? Like I talked about the being flexible, really looking hard. Say if you need workers, look really hard at the jobs that you're putting out there. What can you do to make them a little bit better? Right. Yep. And understanding that if you make a job a little bit better for a worker, like you're probably going to benefit from that too, because they might keep being your worker and they'll be more productive. So, but every business owner is going to have to figure out what's that margin that they can adjust on and feel comfortable with. So that flexibility, it is important to embrace the fact that we are in a moment, right? So when we talked about inflation, I said, okay, let's think about 2020, not 1970, right? Because the challenges now are new. They are real, right? And I think, we talked about inflation. There's also a big conversation about what is the Federal Reserve doing, which is very much tied to inflation. Sure. And then it's what is Congress doing? What is the administration doing? I mean, we are in a moment where we're in the build back better phase. We want infrastructure. We want investments in families and children. The Fed is like, we're going to keep going and not, slam on the brakes, even though there's inflation that you all haven't seen in generations, right? So there's all this stuff happening. So for a small business owner, staying informed, really like getting the information and figuring it out how it fits for you, right? Like don't listen to, it's fine to listen to people like me that work in DC and think about policy, and any news channel, there's a bunch of us saying like 1,000 different things, but the devil is going to be in the detail in all of these programs, especially ones that come out of federal, state, and local governments. And so, and there's going to be new incentives, new money put out for doing different kinds of, whether it's building the affordable housing, whether it's supporting green energy, getting solar panels on everybody's roofs, or there's a lot of being discussed like in the care work economy, like different service sectors. So there are going to be opportunities, but just like the payroll protection loan program, like the federal government is not as good at customer service as a lot of businesses are. So it's being prepared to, roll up the sleeves and figure out what's out there. And when it gets to things that local governments are doing, and there definitely are conversations about getting funding down to state and local levels. Well, frankly, the small business owners as community leaders can help make sure that those funds are used effectively. So that's putting more of a workload on small business owners and communities, but especially since your audience is broader than it's not just people putting in the hours, it's also ones that want to do the investing and want to like work with the community group. So I think that's where there's going to be a moment to do new things and push into new areas, but it's not going to land on your desk with a full instruction set. And, it's going to take some work to figure out what's actually out there and figure out how it actually works for your particular business and community.
Awesome. Well, that was phenomenal. I could chat with you here for hours yet, Claudia. That was Claudia Sahm. Thank you so much for joining us here. This has been Don Wenner on the Impact Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. You can check out our other episodes by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube, or check us out online by going to impactwithdon.com. I encourage and challenge you to make an impact.